Good morning. Good morning. It's good to be here with you together. We're going through the book of Romans. Paul started us off last week. It's a series we're calling Making Peace Together. And I really appreciate that we're calling it that. And actually, I never thought I'd see the day when we'd go through the book of Romans together, because I was buying in to the preconception that Romans is just a kind of a theology handbook, or this really dense, hard to figure out justification and salvation definitions and mechanisms and all that. But we're really trying to dispel that myth. It's called Making Peace Together, and I'll explain why. And a lot of this is going to sound like what Paul said last week, and I think if it's good enough to say once, it's good enough to say twice. Imagine the church in Rome, Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians together in one church. And then imagine all the Jewish Christians are kicked out of the city by the emperor for causing some sort of trouble, or at least they're being blamed for it. Can you imagine if here at Grace Chapel, what it would be like if there was one ethnic group or even one demographic, everyone under a certain age, or everyone who believes X, Y, and Z, if they were kicked out of the city? And what that would be like for Grace Chapel. We'd be missing a really important part of our community. And imagine they're gone for 5 years. And of course, the church would change in those times. And then imagine they're welcomed back 5 years later. The Jewish Christians were welcomed back to Rome when a new emperor came to power. And what do they face when they come back into their church that they used to know? Well, everything's different now. Suddenly there's different people in leadership, different practices, different beliefs. Imagine the tensions between the Jewish Christians and the non-Jewish Christians when they suddenly had to worship together again. A lot of that came down to theology and certain Jewish practices that had been part of the Christian faith, and now maybe they're not so much. Imagine how hard that would be. Romans is the book, the letter, we're reading someone's mail, that Paul wrote to these two groups of people, encouraging them to make peace with each other. It's not an abstract theological textbook. It's a letter to say, please, make peace together. Chapters 1 to 11, the first half, it's about status. We're starting at the beginning. Paul started at the end, but we're going back to the beginning. Our context here at Grace Chapel, it's different than the Roman church, but it's also not so different. We're a diverse group of people, and I'm really not just talking ethnically. On Good Friday, I showed you a video of pictures, portrayals of Jesus from all sorts of different cultures. And I showed you that video, which represents the diversity of expressions, of faith expressions that exist in the world. And they're not just the diversity of faith expressions that exist out there. They are the diversity of faith expressions that exist right here. Our context is different, but it's the same. And last week, Paul outlined 3 different responses that these different groups might have to each other. One way they could have responded to this tension was to dominate the other group, to say, really, you're doing it the wrong way. I am going to show you how to do it. It's this way. The other response, sit back in judgment. The third response is the way of Christ, and that's what the whole book will unpack. But today, chapter 2 that we're looking at, this is where Paul, the apostle, addresses that second way, the sit back and judge way. For those who are sitting back and judging the other people in their community, Paul has some advice to the Jewish people that have returned to the church. It's simple. Don't judge. Don't judge. Stop. I'll read the passage out loud. Romans 2 from the beginning. Remember, he's not talking to Jews in general. Sometimes we read Romans, we think it's about Jewish people in general. He's talking to a specific group of Jewish Christians who are judging non-Jewish Christians for the things that they do and the way that they practice their faith. This is going to sound harsh, but no, this is written in love and concern, Romans 2. You may think you can condemn such people, but you are just as bad, and you have no excuse. When you say they are wicked and should be punished, you are condemning yourself. For you who judge others do these very same things. And we know that God, in his justice, will punish anyone who does such things. Since you judge others for doing these things, why do you think that you can avoid God's judgment when you do the same things? Don't you see how wonderfully kind, tolerant, and patient God is with you? Does this mean nothing to you? Can't you see that his kindness is intended to turn you from your sin? Let me say that Romans, as a letter, is really hard to understand. The rhetoric and the language is complicated and dense, and the tone keeps shifting from one part to another. So I'm going to break down this first part and try to keep it as simple as possible, because for my sake, I had to read this stuff like 50 times before I get it. He's going to give about 5 reasons. Don't judge. Don't judge because, number 1, you do the same things, and you're being a hypocrite. When he says same things, he's referring to chapter 1, and there was this whole list of, sins and problems that Paul was accusing the church of, injustice and greed, envy, boasting, and gossiping. And now, when Paul says, you guys do the same things, I don't know if he literally means you do every single same thing, but he means that in a fundamental way, you're just like them. You've got all the same problems. You've got all the same brokenness inside. And maybe your sin comes out in more hidden and subtle, and especially, I think, maybe like religious ways, perhaps for these Jewish Christians, but you're no better. We're all sinners. We're all broken humans, and none of us is better than another. Stop judging. You're the same as them. Number 2, don't judge, because God is rich in kindness. We receive God's love, and our response should be to freely respond in kind. Love as a free response to love. We know God is rich in kindness towards us, so let's love each other. Paul specifically says that this should turn us to repentance. When we know that God loves this group and that group, us and them, we should turn away from the things that hurt each other. Turn away from the things that hurt God. Number 3, don't judge because God doesn't show favoritism. It seems, in some ways, like God chose a people in the Old Testament to be his covenant people. He chose the Jewish people for a special reason. But he doesn't play favorites. He is not showing favoritism. He has leveled the playing field, and in fact, it was always leveled. And so we too should not be drawing lines to say one group is better or worse than another. When God looks at us, he takes everything into account. He judges us based on where people are and not what their status or religious background or inheritance may be. Number 4, don't judge because, and this is a tough one, we invite judgment on ourselves. Don't judge because you're inviting judgment on yourselves. I don't actually understand how this all works. I think there's a lot of baggage with the word judgment. Sometimes we see the word judgment, we think it's just about some sort of future outcome, heaven or hell. Maybe. I'm not sure it's all about that. We think about judgment, we think of, lightning from the sky when we've done something wrong. I don't think it's really that either. I think God's judgment is a complicated and many-faceted thing, but part of God's judgment is the natural consequences of our actions. When we do something wrong, when we make wrong decisions, God allows our choices to play out in the expected way. And so when we judge other people, when we draw lines, when we divide our community with hurtful words, hurtful thoughts, it's going to come back on us. It's going to be painful. And God is going to do some painful work on us because our heart is not right. And that is the natural consequences of our judgment on other people. But it's also part of God making the world right. When we choose not to walk in love, there are painful things that are inevitable. And God makes it over time so that the world has become right, and that means it's going to be painful for us when we're choosing not to walk in love. The last reason I want to say for why we shouldn't judge, this is in the letter. Don't judge because I'm thinking a church, a religious institution, we have a tendency for arrogance over time. Pick any church in the world. Pick any religious institution in the world. When things have been the same for a long time, when there are certain historic practices that haven't changed, well, they tend to get set in stone. And we tend to think that's the only way to do it. And we tend to judge people when they veer away from certain historic practices. We tend to institutionalize the way that the Spirit moved last, I remember someone saying. We have a certain degree of historical privilege if we've been in a community that has existed in the same way for a long time. And we have to be able to put down that privilege, as John Corbin mentioned a few weeks ago, so that for the sake of harmony, for the sake of unity, we need to admit that maybe our way is not the only way. Paul is not just saying, don't judge as general advice, but he's talking to a specific community, a specific Jewish segment of a church, saying, don't judge the non-Jewish people in your community. Think of the segments represented here. There is a mix of people in this room, in our community. There are people that are on one end of a political spectrum, liberal and conservative. There are people that are online, people that are virtual, people that are new to their faith, people that are old in their faith, people who think it's okay to do certain things like drink alcohol, and people who certainly do not think that's okay. People that are extroverted, exuberant with their praise and worship, and people that are contemplative, introverted. There are people that are really, really involved in the comings and goings in every ministry here, and there are people that really choose not to be involved and sit sort of on the sidelines. There are rich and not so rich. There are people from every denominational background, single people, married people, and yes, of course, people from different countries, different ethnic groups. All of these, put them in the same room together, challenges come up. And we judge each other because that group is not like my group. There's something special about Grace Chapel community, and it's true for a lot of communities, but our community is a community of first impressions. And that every single week, there's someone new who walks in the door. And that means that every single week, you are being seen by the first time. Every single week, someone's going to come in, and they've never seen you in your life. They're going to look at you, and they're going to make a judgment about you. And the other thing is true, too, the flip side. Every single week, someone new is going to walk in the door, and you're going to look at them and judge them in an instant. You can guarantee it. Those first impressions, they're long-lasting, and they're hard to get through. They're usually shallow. They're merely based only on appearance or how someone holds themselves or speaks. And we just put people in a box within seconds without even really encountering them. What can I say? Let's not do that. Let's do better. Let's do better, not because judging someone is inherently wrong. That's obvious. Like, we all think that. But because when the gospel takes a hold of a community, when the Spirit begins to transform hearts, it creates communities of love and welcome and acceptance. And when we judge each other, we keep that from happening. Dare I say that a diverse and welcoming community of Jesus followers is how God makes the world new, through little pockets of diverse and welcoming people. It's not just part of God's plan. It is the plan. God makes the world new through communities of diverse and welcoming Jesus followers. When I was in university, I remember being welcomed to a young adult retreat at Malagash. And the idea was that they hadn't had one of these in a while, and they were welcoming back all sorts of people that had gone to camp when they were a teenager, maybe who hadn't seen each other. Let's bring everyone back together and reconnect. All these people you haven't seen in a while. And I was excited to go to this retreat to connect with people that I hadn't seen in a while. But I went into it, I believe, with preconceived notions about what all these people were like, because I hadn't seen them for a while. And really the only exposure I had to them was on social media and the things that they were posting, and I was judging them as, these are bad decisions. These are bad decisions. This person has, I don't know, gone off the rails, and here I am, I'm the one who stayed on the Christian path, and just like the resentful sort of bigger brother in the prodigal son. So I went into it already judging these people. Of course, something special happened. When you put everyone in the same room, you start to talk, you start to play, sing, eat, and you realize these are 3D people. They're not just caricatures. They're deep. They're complex. And when we were all honest with each other, it moved me. And I realized I've completely misjudged. I've completely misjudged them. And they're not perfect. They made mistakes. Sure. So had I. Who am I to judge someone else's life? And I think the relationships became possible again when we're able to actually be together, when we're able to eat. Really, I think eating is a huge part. Walls come down when you talk and when you eat. It's a lesson that I've learned the hard way again and again as a youth pastor. If there was honestly one lesson I had to pick, you just can't write people off. You can't write people off. People surprise me constantly, not because what they're doing is somehow out of character, but because I so quickly begin to tell stories about them in my mind, and in so doing, I ignore them, I dismiss them, or I think this person has no potential. Maybe they're shy. Maybe they're rough around the edges. Maybe they're just different than me. And God, in his mercy, again and again says, Pelham, not so fast. It's usually circumstances beyond my control. I don't always choose them, but you find yourself having a chance to connect with somebody, to talk with them, to eat with them, to learn about them. And every single time, I'm just amazed at the complexity and the beauty of another person that I had just written off. A piece of advice for us to take away is to pay attention to the stories that you tell yourself about other people. Take a minute to reflect on the stories that you tell about other people, especially whole other groups of people, especially whole other groups of people within this church. Some stories, maybe they seem small, they seem harmless, maybe others are more intense. But any story that seeks to label another group as bad or inferior or unworthy or somehow less than is really, really dangerous in a community. And Paul, who wrote this letter, sees there's a danger here, and he wants to address it. I chatted with Steve Green this week about something totally different, but he shared some real wisdom with me, because I was actually going through this process of telling a story about another person and trying to get rid of it. And Steve said, the Apostle Steve, he said, when you're tempted to maybe explain someone's behavior, or when you're tempted to tell a certain story about another person, ask yourself, can you come up with at least 3 other stories that may be true? Can you think of 3 alternative reasons for why someone is acting the way they're acting? Why? Because it forces us to open our minds about other people, their motives and their behaviors. It allows us at least to be curious. And it keeps us from judging people unfairly. When you think of the other people in your community right here, and we're really just thinking within the church, do you see people as caricatures, as stereotypes, as two-dimensional, as just another face of a person who walks by you on a Sunday? Or do you see them as wonderfully complex, with their own backstory? They're beautiful, beloved children of God, every bit as beautiful and beloved and complex as you are. I mean, don't you wish that someone thought that about you? Don't you wish that others would take the chance to get to know you? To look past your flaws or your appearance and actually know you and see you and love you? Let's not be ships passing in the night, if you know what I mean. Let's not jump to conclusions about each other. Not that I imagine that we're all stewing with bitterness and resentment here. Actually, I really don't think that's true about this community. Far from it. But I do wonder how we dismiss each other, how we create judgments about each other based on our perceived differences. In Grace Chapel, certainly ethnic diversity is the most visible. But I do believe that theological differences are just as significant, and they're even harder to come together over. There was a time, this predated me by a long time, where Grace Chapel became egalitarian, where they welcomed women into leadership. And I wasn't there, so I don't know exactly how this played out. But some people left. And I understand that some people feel like they have to leave when maybe churches take a stance that they don't feel like they can be there anymore. And I understand, and these things are complex, but it's really hard to come together over differences. That's all I want to say. We need to acknowledge that it's hard to be unified when we label each other through the lens of issues. This person believes this, so they're like that. This person believes this, so they're like that. And when we let someone's opinion on something be the single biggest thing we think about when we look at them, that's a problem. The practicalities of how a community comes together with disagreements, that's really tough. Can a community be truly unified when there seems like there's a disagreement on a really important issue? I don't have an easy answer to that. I mean, you name the issue, and we have different opinions on it here. I don't know how a community can really function when they disagree, but I can tell you deep down that I believe it's possible. And it's possible not because of any mediation or reconciliation tactics or smart conversations that we can have with each other. It's possible because that's what Jesus does when the Spirit takes hold of a community. Christ is in the reconciliation business, and he's all about bringing disparate and different people together to love each other unconditionally, no matter what. And for that reason alone, I think it's possible. When we talk about diversity in theology, which exists here, and I think of unification, unity in that area, it's not that we just all need to be quiet and not share what we think or feel. It's not like a don't ask, don't tell, and just try to get along with everybody. Don't bring up that thing. True unity in a community is one where we do feel safe to express ourselves, where each of us doesn't have to pretend that we sit somewhere apathetically in the middle. When you can't express yourself, I know it leads to strong emotions and complicated discussions, but it's not a bad thing. All the more reason when things get tough to pay attention to each other, to pay attention to how you're reacting to someone else's opinion, to truly listen to the other person, to respect them, to give them space, and to ask the Spirit to unify us in ways that, listen, we just can't do it on our own. I think we need to pray for it, because it doesn't just happen through our own effort. We don't just need to hope for unity or try to keep things calm and smooth. We actually need to pray for it. I came across a one-line prayer in a book that I'm going to read for you today, and then maybe it's a prayer for our community. Even in conflict, may I see people as beloved instead of problematic. Even in conflict, may I see people as beloved instead of problematic. So maybe you think that I'm preaching to the choir here. Maybe you think that all this message, don't judge, maybe you think it's not for you because you're not judgmental. To which I say, thank you for not being judgmental. That's it. Thank you. I'm not here to accuse you of being judgmental. Just ask you not to judge me up here. I'm not here to accuse anyone of anything, but I do want to give Paul's words a place because they're a warning. A lot of you, you're sitting here and cheering, yeah, don't judge. I'm all about that. I think we can all agree that is a good thing. And it's kind of trendy, right? Not to be judgmental. Actually, that's a good thing about our culture, that we're against judging each other. It's a great thing. But here's the other side of the judgment coin. There's another side of judgment that's just as dangerous as judging or labeling another person. The other side that's dangerous is when we're afraid of being judged. Just as dangerous to our community. I think there are a lot of people in every church, definitely ours, that are afraid of being judged, so they just hold back. I'm not going to let myself, when I walk through those doors, be myself. I'm going to take my personality down to 10%. I'm going to kind of mute myself, and I'm just going to fit in because deep down there's a fear. I do this a lot here because I'm a people pleaser and I have those kinds of tendencies, and it's easy to just say things that make people happy. Do I really think that anyone's going to judge me or condemn me or label me if I did X or Y? Actually, no, if I rationally think it through. But that doesn't mean that my mind doesn't go there sometimes. This is a journey for me, being comfortable in my own skin, in my own community. And you need to go on that journey too. If you have ever walked in here and just felt that you're afraid of being judged for who you are, you have to allow yourself to be you when you come in here. And I think this is true, that you'll be surprised, that you're met with love and acceptance. On an even deeper level, even if we are judged when we come in here, we need to rest in what the book of Romans says, in what Paul writes in chapter 8. He says, it doesn't matter what other people condemn you for or judge you for. Therefore, there's no condemnation for you if you're in Christ Jesus. There's no condemnation for you if you're in Christ Jesus. That's how he starts chapter 8, and he ends chapter 8 by saying, if God is for us, then who can be against us? Who can be against us? It's God that's for us. That's chapter 8. Bring it back to chapter 2. We're going to skip through to verse 13. After Paul says to these Jewish Christians, don't judge, he then starts to talk about how impartial God is. God is so fair. And he specifically takes this one bias, this one idea that the group of Jewish Christians have. They think that because they have received the law, that they are God's chosen people, that somehow this has made them the elect. Somehow they're superior. They're a more righteous group of people. They have better access to God. This is for one specific group of Jewish Christians. This is what Paul writes in Romans 2:13. For merely listening to the law doesn't make us right with God. It's obeying the law that makes us right in his sight. Even Gentiles, that's non-Jewish people, even Gentiles who do not have God's written law, show that they know his law when they instinctively obey it, even without having heard it. They demonstrate that God's law is written on their heart. For their own conscience and their thoughts either accuse them or tell them that they're doing right. Paul, in a word, is saying it's more important to do right than to know right. It's more important to actually do the right thing than to just know what the right thing is to do. The Jewish people, they had the law. They knew the law, which, it gives them a better glimpse at God's character, perhaps. But it came with this special responsibility to be a light to the world. But in God's eyes, For each individual person, it didn't matter if they were from this background or this background. And guess what? It turns out that the Gentile Christians were instinctively obeying the law when the Jewish Christians were not. It turns out they were loving their neighbor. They were caring for the poor. They're honoring God with their work and their life. Turns out these Gentile Christians had the law written on their heart. It turns out that the Spirit had transformed them. It turns out, wouldn't you know, that was God's plan all along. The Jewish Christians, Paul tells them, you can't rest on your laurels. You can't just rely on your heritage to be right before God. You can't rely on having the law or feeling like you're elect. You can't rely on feeling like you're part of God's chosen people. It gives you no special privilege. What is it saying to a community like ours? It doesn't matter what your background is. It doesn't matter how much Bible knowledge you have. It doesn't matter if you come from a Christian family or you're from a Christian country. It doesn't matter what religious box you tick on a census. It doesn't matter if you have a theology degree or if you're involved in a ministry. It doesn't matter if you're a Sunday school teacher. It doesn't matter if you can explain all mysteries and all knowledge, like Paul says in Corinthians. What matters is love and how you live. There was a famous study in 1973. Maybe you've heard of it. A bunch of seminary students were recruited for a study, a bunch of people that are studying Bible or want to become a pastor or something like this. And they had to prepare a presentation. Half the group had to prepare a presentation on career prospects, and the other group had to prepare a presentation on the parable of the Good Samaritan. That is, when the man is walking on the road, he sees someone who is beat up, he doesn't help him, and then a Samaritan comes along and helps him. Okay, so you have two groups who are both thinking about different things. One group that's thinking about helping people, Jesus' words. And both groups of people are told, okay, oh shoot, you're late. You're late for the presentation. You got to run across campus, and you got to deliver that presentation in 5 minutes. So the people they're gathering their papers together, and they're running across campus, and what do you think happens? What do you think they encounter on the road? A man hunched up on the ground, moaning. What are they going to do? As they have academic commitments, they've done this presentation. So the test was to see, did the people who study the Good Samaritan, who've spent time meditating on Jesus' words and helping the other, are those people more likely to help this man on the ground than the people who are just doing another kind of presentation? What do you think the answer was? No more likely. The results were exactly the same. Many of the seminary students, they just ignored the man. They literally stepped over him. It didn't matter how much these students knew about the Bible, whether they'd been thinking about Jesus' words all morning. At the end of the day, what matters is how they treated people. That's what matters for us. It doesn't matter if we're right or if we're religious or we know the right answers. How are you treating people? How are you treating the less fortunate? And how are you treating the people that are different in your community? Well, last week, we ended our service with a great song, Build Your Kingdom Here. It's very fun. But there's a line that struck me in that song that I recalled. We all sang this together. If you were here, you said this. It came out of your mouth. We are the hope on earth. You said that last week. Now, say there's an onlooker that comes into the building, and they see a whole group of people singing, we are the hope on earth. How does that strike them? Well, it probably sounds like we're just trying to puff ourselves up. And if a stranger came in and said, okay, I don't care what you say about yourself. I don't care what you call yourself. What are you actually doing to be the hope on earth? If that's the title you're taking, how are you actually living? So, don't just sing it. Don't just sing it. Go be it. Go do it. Live lives of hope, generosity, love, inclusion. And do it alongside all these different people who are all different than you. Your brothers and sisters that for some reason or another, God has decided to place you alongside them. Instead of judging, embrace. Instead of dominating, submit. And instead of wielding our heritage or our knowledge as a weapon, lay it down and put first things first. None of us have got it all together. None of us have earned God's love. But all of us are offered it. All of us have been welcomed into God's family. He has showered us with mercy and grace. So can we at least begin or continue to show that mercy and grace to each other? Amen.